Section 99 of 15,000 Useful Phrases by Grenville Kleiser, read for LibriVox.org by David Best. Half choked by a rising paroxysm of rage, half suffocated by his triumph, hardened into convictions and resolves, haughtiness and arrogance were largely attributed to him. Haunt the recesses of the memory. Haunted with a chill and unearthly foreboding, he accosted me with trepidation. He adroitly shifted his ground. He airily lampooned their most cherished prejudices. He bowed submission. He braced himself to the exquisite burden of life. He condescended to intimate speech with her. He conversed with a colorless fluency. He could detect the hollow ring of fundamental nothingness. He could do absolutely naught. He drank of the spirit of the universe. He drew near to a desperate resolve. He evinced his displeasure by a contemptuous sneer or grim scowl. He felt an unaccountable loathing. He felt the ironic rebound of her words. He flung diffidence to the winds. He flushed crimson. He found the silence intolerably irksome. He frowned perplexedly. He gave her a baffled stare. He gave himself to a sudden daydream. He gave his ear to this demon of false glory. He grew wanton with success. He had acted with chivalrous delicacy of honor. He had the eye of an eagle in his trade. He had the gift of deep, dark silences. He held his breath in admiring silence. He laughed away my protestations. He lent no countenance to insensate prattle. He listened greedily and gazed intent. He made a loathsome object. He made the politest of monosyllabic replies. He murmured a civil rejoinder. He murmured a vague acceptance. He mused a little while in grave thought. He never wears an argument to tatters. He only smiled with fatuous superiority. He paused, stunned and comprehending. He perceived the iron hand within the velvet glove. He raised a silencing hand. He ruled autocratically. He sacrificed the vulgar prizes of life. He sat on thorns. He shambled away with speed. He sighed deeply from a kind of mental depletion. He smote her quickening sensibilities. He submitted in brooding silence. He suppressed every sign of surprise. He surrendered himself to gloomy thought. He threaded a labyrinth of obscure streets. He threw a ton's weight of resolve upon his muscles. He threw out phrases of ill humor. He threw round a measuring eye. He treads the primrose path of dalliance. He used an unguarded adjective. He was a tall, dark, saturnine youth, sparing of speech. He was aware of emotion. He was born to a lively and intelligent patriotism. He was dimly mistrustful of it. He was discreetly silent. He was empty of thought. He was entangled in a paradox. He was giving his youth away by handfuls. He was haunted and begirt by presences. He was measured and urbane. He was most profoundly skeptical. He was nothing if not grandiloquent. He was quaking on the precipice of a bad billows attack. He was utterly detached from life. He went hot and cold. He would fall into the blackest melancholies. He writhed in the grip of a definite apprehension. He writhed with impotent humiliation. Her blank gaze chilled you. Her bright eyes were triumphant. Her eyes danced with malice. Her eyes dilated with pain and fear. Her eyes were full of wondering interest. Her eyes were limpid, and her beauty was softened by an air of indolence and languor. Her face stiffened anew into a gray obstinacy. Her face was lit up by a glow of inspiration and resolve. Her haughty step waxed timorous and vigilant. Her head throbbed dangerously. Her heart appeared to abdicate its duties. Her heart fluttered with a vague terror. Her heart pounded in her throat. Her heart was full of speechless sorrow. Her hurrying thoughts clamored for utterance. Her imagination recoiled. Her interest flagged. Her life had dwarfed her ambitions. Her limbs ran to marble. Her lips hardened. Her lips parted in a keen expectancy. Her mind was a storehouse of innocuous anecdote. Her mind was beaten to the ground by the catastrophe. Her mood was unaccountably chilled. Her musings took a sudden and arbitrary twist. Her scarlet lip curled cruelly. Her smile was faintly depreciatory. Her smile was linked with a sigh. Her solicitude thrilled him. Her stare dissolved. Her step seemed to pity the grass it pressed. Her strength was scattered in fits of agitation. Her stumbling ignorance which sought the road of wisdom. Her thoughts outstripped her erring feet. Her tone was gathering remonstrance. Her tongue on the subject was sharpness itself. Her tongue stumbled and was silent. Her voice had the coaxing inflections of a child. Her voice trailed off vaguely. Her voice was full of temper, hard-held. Her voice, with a tentative question in it, rested in air. Her wariness seemed put to rout. His accents breathed profound relief. His agitation increased. His brow grew knit and gloomy. His brow was in his hand. His conscience leapt to the light. His constraint was excruciating. His curiosity is quenched. His dignity counseled him to be silent. His ears sang with the vibrating intensity of his secret existence. His eyes had a twinkle of reminiscent pleasantry. His eyes literally blazed with savage fire. His eyes shone with the pure fire of a great purpose. His eyes stared unseeingly. His face caught the full strength of the rising wind. His face dismissed its shadow. His face fell abruptly into stern lines. His face lit with a fire of decision. His face showed a pleasant bewilderment. His face torn with conflict. His face was gravely authoritative. His gaze faltered and fell. His gaze searched her face. His gaze seemed full of unconquerable hopefulness. His hand supported his chin. His hands were small and prehensible. His heart asserted itself again, thunderously beating. His heart rebuked him. His heart was full of enterprise. His impatient scorn expired. His last illusions crumbled. His lips loosened in a furtively exultant smile. His lips seemed to be permanently parted in a good-humored smile. His mind echoed with words. His mind leapt gladly to meet new issues and fresh tides of thought. His mind was dazed and wandering in a mist of memories. His mood yielded. His mouth quivered with pleasure. His passions vented themselves with sneers. His pulses leapt anew. His reputation had withered. His sensibilities were offended. His shrewd gaze fixed appraisingly upon her. His soul full of fire and eagle-winged. His soul was compressed into a single agony of prayer. His soul was wrung with a sudden wild homesickness. His speech faltered. His swift and caustic satire. His temper was dark and explosive. His thoughts galloped. His thoughts were in clamoring confusion. His tone assumed a certain asperity. His torpid ideas awoke again. His troubled spirit shifted its load. His vagrant thoughts were in full career. His voice insensibly grew inquisitorial. His voice was thick with resentment and futile protest. His whole face was lighted with a fierce enthusiasm. His whole frame seemed collapsed and shrinking. His whole tone was flippant and bumptious. His words trailed off brokenly. His youthful zeal was contagious. Hope was far and dim. How sweet and reasonable the pale shadows of those who smile from some dim corner of our memories. Humiliating paltriness of revenge. End of section 99. This recording is in the public domain.